Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, as the case may be. Whatever it is, wherever you are, I hope it's a good one. I'm Phil Rumrill. I'm a professor of rehabilitation counseling and director of the Center for Disability Studies at Kent State University in Ohio. And I'm glad to be here today to provide some information regarding the employment and vocational rehabilitation concerns of Americans with multiple sclerosis, or MS. I'd like to thank the folks at Virginia Commonwealth University for including me in this webcast series, and I'd like to thank the National Multiple Sclerosis Society for its generous sponsorship and support of our research regarding the employment of people with MS over the past 20 years or so. A few things we know about, a little overview of MS before we get into the nuts and bolts of employment considerations. We know that MS is one of the most common neurological disorders in the world. In fact, it affects as many as 400,000 people in the United States alone. That's one in every 750 Americans approximately. MS primarily affects women of European descent. About 2/3 of Americans with MS are female, and that's not an uncommon gender distribution among many autoimmune disorders, MS included. So it's far more common among women than it is among men. I mentioned it predominates among people of European extraction, Caucasians, and so countries in the world in Northern Europe, Western Europe, Canada, and the United States have especially high incidences and prevalences of MS. So you see high rates of MS in those countries owing to the demographic and genetic profiles of people who inhabit those countries. What happens with MS is that the immune system essentially turns on white matter tracts in the central nervous system, that is the brain and the spinal cord. The immune system recognizes the myelin, which is the fatty insulation that surrounds nerve tissue, creates insulation much like the rubberized coating on an electrical wire insulates the wires. That's exactly the function of the myelin with regard to nerve tissue. The immune system recognizes the myelin as a foreign body and metabolizes it. The immune system then reacts to these breaks or cracks or lesions in the myelin by applying scar tissue to protect the nerves further. When the scar tissue is formed, that's the tissue that shows up as an abnormality on magnetic resonance imaging scans, CAT scans, and what have you, and that's how we're able to diagnose multiple sclerosis. So in order to be diagnosed with MS, you have to have these lesions in at least 2 locations, hence the term multiple sclerosis, in your brain or along your spinal cord. The plaques or scar tissue that forms over these lesions can block the transmission of electrical impulses from the brain to the rest of the body via the spinal cord. And so very much like what happens when the rubber coating around an electrical wire is broken or cut, what happens with the electrical impulses in folks with MS is they come across as uncoordinated or disjointed. Some of the signals don't get through the way that they should. And so it can create a wide range of symptoms for people who are affected. The cause of MS is thought to be a combination of genetic, immunologic, and environmental factors. People, it is thought, inherit a predisposition to MS, or at least to a compromised immune system. Then there's usually some environmental trigger that the person may or may not be aware of. Could be a virus, it could be pregnancy, it could be surgery, any number of things that creates a stress on the immune system, and then the autoimmune response takes place. And most experts believe that people have to have all of those factors in place in order to acquire MS. From a vocational rehabilitation standpoint, MS is interesting and uniquely challenging in that it tends to manifest itself between the ages of 20 and 40. about 3/4 of MS diagnoses are conferred between the ages of 20 and 40, with the peak incidence of initial symptoms usually occurring around age 30. So if you think about what's happening in people's lives during their 20s and 30s, primarily when MS usually manifests itself, it's a very busy and active time in people's lives. The establishment and maintenance phases of career development are happening. People are completing their formal training, they're initiating their careers, they're establishing themselves in their careers, also beginning families and creating lives of their own in all kinds of ways. So these are busy and active decades in people's lives, and it's a lousy time to acquire an intrusive illness like MS. But depending on the size and location of those lesions that I mentioned that are the markers for MS, a wide range of symptoms can accompany this disease. So and it's really a geographic issue. The part of the brain or spinal cord that is compromised by MS corresponds to the functional area that the symptoms interfere with. So given that, and given that MS can occur at any spot along the spinal cord or in the brain, we see a wide range of symptoms that cut across virtually every personal and social activity. The most common symptom of MS is fatigue. As many as 80 to 85% of people experience some form of fatigue as a function of MS. You also see a lot of other physiological effects: mobility problems, diminished strength and coordination, particularly in the extremities; numbness and tingling, particularly in the hands and feet; chronic pain; hypersensitivity to heat; spasticity, another issue; bowel and bladder dysfunction; sexual dysfunction; cognitive impairment. About 60% of people with MS, by their own report, experience some form of cognitive impairment as a result of MS. Visual impairment, particularly blurred and double vision. We see these issues happening a lot. Speech disfluency, mobility problems related that require the use sometimes of scooters or motorized mobility aids, also mobility canes; ataxic gait. People will tend to stumble and walk in an uneven manner; slurred speech, word find issues, and of course psychoaffective issues as well. Depression is very common among folks with MS. Bipolar disorder is increasingly common these days, and also various anxiety disorders as well. With regard to the psychoaffective issues, sometimes it's difficult to know whether those responses are due to organic changes in the brain, in the location, in the parts of the brain that govern mood and affect, or whether these are just adjustmental responses to a very intrusive and difficult chronic illness, or some combination thereof. And so it's very difficult to know whether the affective responses have to do with organic changes to the brain as a result of the disease's etiology, or whether these are adjustmental in nature. And so treatments for the mental health issues include both psychopharmacological treatments as well as counseling and therapy. But we see a much higher rate of psychological distress in folks with MS than we do in the general population. Small wonder given the number and range of symptoms that people experience. Some unique features of MS that distinguish it from other chronic illnesses that are worth noting. One, as I mentioned, the high incidence among women. So we have gender issues tied up in the understanding of what MS is and how it affects people. The onset in early to middle adulthood, there'll be more on that later, but this creates a really unique rehabilitation profile as opposed to chronic illnesses that occur later in life. Generally normal life expectancies. People with MS are living longer and healthier lives than ever before. And so we talk about employment and career development really across the lifespan, and the concerns of folks with MS regarding employment go well into and past traditional retirement age. The presence of cognitive symptoms is another issue that distinguishes MS from many other chronic illnesses, and cognitive impairment, one of the very most difficult aspects of the illness to deal with, to accommodate on the job, etc. MS usually doesn't affect people's overall general intelligence, but about 60% of folks with MS experience some form of localized cognitive impairment in one area or another, whether that's some part of memory or abstract reasoning abilities or making social judgments, executive functioning, what have you. So we see cognitive impairment being a very difficult part of the illness to deal with. Another thing about MS that makes it complicated and really distinguishes it from other chronic illnesses as well. Not all chronic illnesses, but the chronic and unpredictable nature of the disease. MS is usually characterized by periods of relapses and remissions, these cycles. Often when the person is in a remission stage, he or she is experiencing no or very few symptoms, and then symptoms will flare up without warning, usually without any indication of which symptoms will occur at any given time. And so the psychological uncertainty that goes along with MS and how it varies both among and within individuals can be a very difficult specter for folks with MS who are affected by this condition, as well as their families. Other chronic illnesses have more predictable symptom patterns, not necessarily in terms of onset, but in terms of the symptoms that might accompany the disease. And the symptoms of MS can vary even within the individual. Over time, the symptom profile can change. So it's a very unpredictable condition, which makes a planful, linear, serial process like career development, vocational rehabilitation planning very difficult to undertake. Finally, a unique feature of MS is the impact that it has on employment and career development, and that's what we will get to now. Let's take a look at what we know about MS in the world of work. We know that 90 to 95% of Americans with MS have employment histories. That means they've worked at some point in the past. This shouldn't be surprising owing to the age at onset. By the time people are in their late 20s, early 30s, which is when MS tends to manifest itself, they've already begun their careers, often have completed their formal training. So you would expect this group of workers to have prior work experience, and they do. Even at the time of diagnosis, about 3/4 of Americans with MS were still employed. Yet as time and the illness progress, we see a precipitous decline in employment, in labor force participation, one that is not fully explained even by the range and severity of MS symptoms. Within 5 years after diagnosis, estimates are that as many as half of folks with MS disengage from the workforce, often going on Social Security disability insurance or long-term disability insurance. And the current employment rate for Americans with MS nationwide is somewhere between 25 and 35%, depending on the study. So we've got a very significant group of people with MS, these experienced and productive workers who disengage from the workforce really in droves fairly soon after diagnosis. These statistics really call for the early intervention kinds of principles that many of our vocational rehabilitation interventions in our field are predicated on, and that's certainly true with folks with MS, and the need for early detection and early intervention as a means of preventing job loss. Very, very important, but we'll talk about that later. We've done some studies of unemployed people with MS, and we find that 3/4 of folks with MS who are not working left their jobs voluntarily. So the stereotype that the person goes and discloses MS to the employer, and the employer says, okay, that's nice, you're fired, is not really how it works in the main. What we find is that folks with MS tend to make that decision on their own, and they choose to voluntarily leave the workforce. What we don't know is how much help they get in making that decision through environments that are less than conducive to reasonable accommodations, attitudes of coworkers, et cetera, but we know that the ultimate choice to stop working is usually made by the person with MS himself or herself. We know that 80% of folks with MS nationwide who are unemployed believe that they could still work. They believe they still have the ability to work or could go back into the workforce if there were opportunities available to them. And we know that 3/4 of Americans with MS who are unemployed say they would like to go back to work. So as we put all of these statistics together, what we have is a profile of these experienced, seasoned, productive workers, most of whom, the vast majority of whom have employment histories, still working at the point of diagnosis. And very soon after that, very soon after that, these people begin a very sharp and mass exodus, from the workforce, to the extent that 25 to 35% of Americans with MS are currently employed. But those folks who disengage from the workforce by those other statistics I mentioned a moment ago usually leave the workforce of their own choosing, usually before the illness has rendered them incapable of working by their own reports, and then, as evidenced by the latter statistic I mentioned a moment ago, that 3/4 of folks with MS would like to return to work, they end up regretting that decision because they'd like to re-enter the workforce. And that becomes an exceedingly difficult proposition once people have disengaged from the workforce and availed themselves of disability and Social Security benefits. It's very difficult to help someone get back into the workforce once they've internalized that message that they're too disabled to work. So we've got our work cut out for us in terms of looking for and trying to identify interventions that can help to make a dent in this very low rate of labor force participation, which deprives people with MS the opportunity to make a living and retain their identities as workers. The therapeutic benefits of working, which are well documented, of course, also deprives society of the expertise and talent from this experienced and productive and sophisticated pool of workers. We've got a well-educated group of folks in Americans with MS. 97% of people with MS are high school graduates, 40% are college graduates, and so we see this well-trained, experienced, seasoned, productive group of workers leaving the workforce seemingly prematurely and then regretting the decision to do that. So in developing vocational rehabilitation interventions to help people with MS to stay employed as long as they wish to, one of the things that researchers have done is to examine the factors that are associated with employment status. In other words, which people with MS are more likely to leave the workforce, which people with MS are less likely to leave their jobs, and what can we learn about the factors that both impede and enhance employability following MS. And so my colleagues and I and other researchers have been involved in these pursuits for a long time, and we find that there are a number of factors that do seem to be associated with employment status. For example, we know that women with MS are more likely to leave their jobs than are men with MS, more likely to disengage from the workforce at sooner following diagnosis than men are. Okay, we know that people with higher levels of educational attainment tend to remain in the workforce after MS longer than people with lower levels of education. We know that the type of symptoms, the symptom profile that people experience as a result of the illness can be predictive of one's prospects for continued employment. And the strongest symptom-related predictor of employment status is cognitive impairment. In several studies, researchers have found that people who have cognitive impairment as part of their MS experience are 4 to 6 times more likely to be unemployed than are people with MS for whom cognitive impairment is not part of the disease experience. So that's the leading predictor of symptom-related predictor of employment status. Mobility impairment and the extent, the level of severity of overall functional limitation also are predictive of job loss, but not to the extent that cognitive impairments are. So this is a very, very important issue, and as people think about accommodations on the job, looking at ways to enhance cognitive and preserve cognitive functioning is a really important part of any kind of job retention initiative. We know that the type of job that a person customarily works in has a lot to do with his or her prospects for continued employment. We know that people whose jobs require a great deal of physical exertion or require them to work out of doors or where there's not climate control, even if they're indoors in a factory where it's too hot or too cold, those people tend to disengage from the workforce much sooner than people whose jobs do not require as much exertion and where the sensitivity to temperature change doesn't affect them quite as prominently. We also know that the attitudes and reactions of coworkers have a lot to do with people's prospects for ongoing employment. If the work environment appears to be receptive and accommodating, then we find that there are very few disability-related issues that we can't, we can't overcome through accommodations and communication with employee and employer. In situations where the environment is less accommodating and coworkers and employers are perceived as less accommodating, we see people leaving their workforce, leaving their jobs and departing the workforce even more quickly. And of course we have the phenomenon of employment discrimination, the ultimate behavioral manifestation of negative attitudes toward people with disabilities, a truly insidious problem for folks with MS. 80% of Americans with MS feel that they've been discriminated against at some point in their work lives because of their MS. This is a big problem. People with MS report significant problems in being denied reasonable accommodations, being treated unfairly in the hiring process, having access to benefits, especially health insurance, being denied promotions, receiving the same pay as non-disabled workers, and people with MS repeatedly tell us that issues related to unfair treatment are those that drive them from the workforce in far too many cases. We have done some studies where we've looked at the types of allegations of discrimination that people with MS have filed with the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, going all the way back to 1992. And we found that about 4,500 people with MS have made allegations of employment discrimination since that time. We find that compared to people with other disabilities, people with MS are less likely to make allegations in the areas of hiring. They're more likely to file allegations related to reasonable accommodations, job retention, and benefits, and they are more likely to prevail in the EEOC's investigatory process. In other words, to have the EEOC rule that that discrimination likely occurred than are people with other disabilities. Effective with the amendment, the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA Amendments Act, which took effect in 2009, multiple sclerosis is one of the 13 presumptive disability categories where if you have MS, you are in effect considered presumptively disabled under the ADA Amendments Act. It's one of the it's one of the conditions that are listed that are examples of legitimate ADA disabilities. And so folks with MS are having an easier time being conferred status as people with disabilities in ADA complaints as well as litigation, and we find that they're prevailing in the EEOC's process more often than people with other disabilities. Again, keep in mind we have a sophisticated, well-educated group of workers, skilled, professional, technical level employees prior to the onset of MS, and so that may have something to do with their abilities to advocate for themselves and to have their needs addressed and redressed as the case may warrant. We've also done a number of studies over the years looking at the employment concerns of people with MS. All of the things I was just talking about are taken from studies of the profiles of unemployed versus employed people with MS. But what about the voices of people with MS, and what about the concerns and experiences that they articulate? When we're thinking about developing vocational rehabilitation interventions, what kinds of things are they concerned about? And we've done a number of studies over the years looking at the employment concerns of folks with MS, and I just want to hit some of the highlights. One of the most recurrent concerns related to employment for people with MS has to do with disclosure. What do I tell my employer? How do I go about doing that? What are the requirements for disclosure under the ADA Amendments Act, the Family and Medical Leave Act, etc.? What are my rights to privacy? What are the risks and benefits associated with disclosure? A huge issue that people with MS wrestle with all the time. And so we hear this as one of the issues that happens a lot. Another concern that comes up quite often is access to reasonable accommodations in the workplace. People with MS wanting to acquire reasonable accommodations and develop proficiency with technologies that can help them to overcome disability-related work limitations on the job. But how do they go about identifying their needs? Where can they go for resources? What about the job accommodation network? Our fine accommodation consultation service, or the regional ADA centers, the ADA network, one in each region of the country. How do we go about accessing those services and supports? The questions that people with MS have quite frequently. Of course, the issue of health insurance coverage, a big issue for people with disabilities, people with chronic illnesses especially, health insurance portability issues become very important. What kinds of information can employers ask during pre-employment physicals and insurance questionnaires, etc. The pre-existing condition exclusions, which have fallen the way of the Affordable Care Act, but still a concern for folks with MS historically, just thinking about what kind of insurance coverage they may be eligible for and whether it's affected by disability. Relatedly, Social Security, the Social Security Administration's programs, benefits, SSDI, that's Social Security Disability Insurance, for people who have worked for a period of time and are no longer able to work by virtue of disability, or supplemental security income, people who have disabilities and who are also poor and unable to work, and Medicare and Medicaid that relates with SSDI and SSI respectively. People having a lot of questions there, and that's a major concern for folks with MS. The issue of home-based employment comes up in dealing with folks with MS and in asking them questions about their own employment experiences. Can I work at home? Can I telecommute? If I'm not feeling well enough to come into the work station to the office one day, can I work at home? Can I bring my laptop? A good number of Americans are now telecommuting for all or part of the time. Home-based and employment and telecommuting is really becoming a part of how work is done in our society, and people with MS are interested in this phenomenon as well. We see this varying in different parts of the country as far as employers' willingness to work with folks with MS in home-based and telecommuting kinds of arrangements, but it's a question that folks have a lot. The Family and Medical Leave Act and its provisions around unpaid medical leave can take up to 12 weeks per calendar year to attend to your own serious health condition or the serious health condition of a relative. And these issues become very important to folks with MS, and they want to know what the FMLA is all about and what kinds of protections it might afford. We see these issues coming up quite often. The availability of on-the-job supports. Where do we go? Tell us, people with MS ask us often, tell us about the state vocational rehabilitation program and what kinds of services can we receive. These are not people who are accustomed to receiving benefits or services from the government, so they have to kind of relearn the whole process, and how to ask for help becomes a very important issue. The idea of stress management and psychological and social supports, and the role that families can play in encouraging employment and promoting quality of life. Big issue for folks with MS we see as an issue in a lot of the research that we've done. The relationship to employment status and symptoms and overall quality of life. We see people with MS having issues of their health and their employment status are directly related to their perceptions of quality of life, and we see this issue and overarching QOL, quality of life concerns, playing a major role in employment planning and who would be involved and the availability of social supports. Stress management, counseling, and psychological services becomes a big issue for folks with MS. Accessing top quality and affordable health care, specialty care if that's what they need, and the role of their neurologists and nurses and social workers in helping folks with MS to make employment-related decisions, to manage their symptoms, etc. These are some of the other concerns that people with MS that we find people wrestling with and them expressing in surveys that we have conducted over the years. Another issue people with MS talk a lot about is transportation. Some folks with MS relinquish the ability to drive independently and need public transportation or have to rely on others, family, friends, etc., to help them get around. The availability of specialized housing and renovations to your home environment related to employment, because your employment status determines to some extent your ability to make necessary renovations. Your ability to get around in the community and get back and forth to work has a lot to do with your ability to continue in employment, and we see these issues becoming very important for folks with MS as well. So we start to see these, sort of recurring concerns happening over and over. The issue of workplace discrimination is a big concern for folks with MS. How do you know? It's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. What happens when you do encounter it? What do you do about it? Whom do you address your concerns to? How do you go through the internal grievance process at your workplace? How do you head off potential conflicts on the job through communication with your employer? How do you advocate for yourself in the most effective way? We see these becoming very important issues for folks with MS. What role does the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission have in helping to redress allegations of discrimination, as I mentioned before? People with MS have questions about short-term and long-term disability and the progression of disability benefits. Bob Frazier and Brian McMahon and others did some studies looking at the movement from sick leave all the way out to long-term disability and Social Security disability insurance among different disability groups, and they found that people with MS have an exceedingly fast route to Social Security disability insurance once they start taking time off. So that progression of disability benefits, folks with MS are concerned about that, and they're concerned about short-term and long-term disability provisions and the kinds of questions that might arise as they're thinking about accessing those benefits and what benefits are they eligible for, how do they go about applying for Social Security, et cetera, and long-term disability. And once they're on these benefits, can they ever get off? What are the risks of going back into the workforce? How are their benefits continued? Might they be discontinued for one reason or another? Can they be taken away? Some fairly complicated provisions there. What happens when your health status changes? If you're taking a medication that's working very well, what might happen as far as that goes? So those are some more issues related to employment, people with MS, and the idea of accessing their benefits becomes a very, very important issue. For folks with MS who have already disengaged from the workforce, we talk with folks a lot about part-time employment, about volunteer work, about staying busy, staying healthy by staying busy, the therapeutic benefits of being active and working in whatever capacity one can. We also find that MS does not affect people's vocational interests very much. People are still interested in the same kinds of work that they were prior to MS. Their ability to do that their usual customary occupation may have been limited by MS, but their interests are the same. And so the issue of transferable skills analysis and what kinds of things from your previous field of endeavor would transfer or articulate into your new set of concerns. So what do we do about all of these concerns, and what kinds of things can we do to help promote employment opportunities for people with MS, to help this experienced, productive, and sophisticated group of workers stay in the workforce as long as they wish to, and thereby avail society at large of the many contributions that folks with MS can make to our economy. What sorts of things need to be done to improve employment prospects for people with MS? One of the things that we see more and more becoming more and more important is this focuses on early intervention and prevention of job loss. We want to catch folks with MS before they disengage from the workforce. This requires vocational rehabilitation professionals like myself and my students at Kent State University, and rehab professionals working in the state voc rehab system, or in any system for that matter, to liaison and to become liaisons and coordinate their efforts with medical providers. Neurologists, MS specialists, nurses, sometimes social workers are the first point of entry for people with MS into the service delivery system. And we need to get to healthcare professionals and talk about the benefits of helping people with MS continue working as long as they wish to. We need to discourage our colleagues in medicine, discourage them from prescribing unemployment as a treatment for MS. The stress of working and continuing in a job, we believe, pales in comparison to the stress of unemployment and not being able to provide for you and for one's family's needs. So we really believe that people with and without disabilities, but people with MS in particular, are better off working than not working, and should be encouraged to do so as long as they wish to. But an ounce of prevention really does apply here, and if we can keep people on the job, it's much easier to help someone retain employment than it is to start over and have him or her reinitiate his or her career. So that early intervention is very, very important. In the employment research that goes on, we need to conduct studies with larger and better representative national samples. Much of the research that I've quoted here, including research I've been involved with over the years, is with medium and small size samples. We need larger scale investigations to help us understand in a complete context the employment experiences of people with MS. That's going to be very, very important. We also need to understand the needs and concerns of folks with MS who are from traditionally underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. I mentioned that Caucasians are far more likely to acquire MS than people from other groups, but MS incidence and prevalence of MS is growing among African Americans and Hispanic Latinos here in the United States, and we need to do a better job of understanding what are the concerns of folks from traditionally underrepresented groups who acquire MS, and how might issues and disadvantages that relate to race or socioeconomic status, how might those apply to the employment considerations of people with MS for those populations. Very, very important, I think. We need to systematically encourage people with MS to avail themselves of the state vocational rehabilitation program. We see pockets around the country where state VR agencies seem to have a very good record of success in working with folks with MS, and we see other places where people with MS have never heard of these services. So connecting with local chapters of the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation, and other advocacy groups, MS clinics, etc., and having state VR counselors do more outreach to folks with MS, including them in the available applicant pools, we think would help a great deal. I think we may also need to encourage state voc rehab agencies to consider sometimes alternative ways of assessing severity of disability or significance of disability. Most states operate state VR programs operate an order of selection mandate, where services are prioritized in favor of people who have the most significant disabilities and therefore the most significant needs. and people with MS sometimes don't fit into those considerations of most significant disability, particularly when their symptoms might be in remission. So someone who goes into the VR office and is asymptomatic may not appear to have a significant disability, when in fact he or she may have very significant limitations. They're just not evident on that particular day. So encouraging people with MS to be able to describe their worst day scenario when the MS is affecting them, at its worst. That's when they are at their most needy. That's when they would require the most services and supports. And we want to work with folks with MS to fully articulate their needs and limitations in terms of being found eligible for services and supports. Not just the Voc Rehab program, we need to connect folks with MS to the Job Accommodation Network, an excellent resource for rehabilitation professionals, people with disabilities, and employers. The regional ADA centers, very, very important contact as well for folks with MS. We really need to help people with MS become their own best experts regarding employment issues and taking an active role in managing and negotiating the services and supports that are in place to help them. Also, legal advocacy and understanding of the policy initiatives that are in place to help people with MS and other disabling conditions. Need to educate people with MS about the Americans with Disabilities Act as amended, the Family and Medical Leave Act, the Affordable Care Act, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. People with MS really need to apply the knowledge is power maxim and fully understand what their legal rights are. These are some of the, we think, are the really important kinds of interventions and where we're headed with this. Assistive technology, connecting folks with MS to technology resources that can help them to be more comfortable in their homes, in accessing public transportation and other transportation systems, make their lives easier, make their jobs more productive and more fulfilling, but becoming expert in the assistive technologies that are available to help people with MS is another very, very important consideration. We have a limited time here this morning or afternoon or evening, as the case may be. I'm looking at my watch here and I'm running out of time, so I wanted to probably stop here. Invite any listeners to contact the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on workplace supports with any questions or concerns regarding the employment of people with MS. They can contact me and be happy to continue this dialogue with anybody who would like additional information. I know we hit on a lot of things in a fairly brief period of time. Thought of this as a general overview of the employment scene for folks with MS, but there's a lot more detail out there and a lot more good work to be done. We're moving in the right direction. People with MS are living longer and healthier lives and wanting to continue working longer and longer into retirement, but we still have a long way to go in terms of improving the rate of labor force participation and making sure that society benefits from the valuable and productive labor resource that exists within the community of Americans with MS. Thank you for your time and attention.